Welcome to History 300, The Origins of the First World War. Lecture 19, The Crisis Deepens, July the 29th to July the 30th, 1914. It was now Wednesday, July 29th. Austria was at war with Serbia, but as yet there had hardly been any fighting. Austria was mobilizing, but not yet against Russia. Russia had mobilized against Austria, but not yet against Germany, officially anyway. Germany had not yet mobilized at all. Neither had France, neither, except for its navy, had Britain. Britain also yet had not made any definite statement about what it planned to do in the event of hostilities on the European continent. In other words, the situation that Wednesday morning was serious, but not yet critical. There still seemed that there might be enough time to pull back from the brink. President Poincaré and Prime Minister Viviani arrived back in France on the morning of the 29th, after spending 5 days at sea since they had departed St. Petersburg. They returned to a very different country from the one that they had left just a couple of weeks before. Then, France had been completely absorbed in the trial for murder of Madame Caillou, the former Prime Minister's wife. There had scarcely been any interest in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, or foreign politics in general. Now Poincaré and Viviani were surprised to find themselves greeted by crowds of French people waving tricolores and expressing patriotic indignation at the Germans. Clearly, the mood of the public had shifted sharply in a matter of days. On returning to Paris, the two men were briefed by their own ministers, as well as the Russian ambassador, Alexander Izvolsky. This was the same Izvolsky, incidentally, who had been humiliated by Austria's foreign minister Aehrenthal when he was double-crossed during the Bosnian crisis in 1909. Ever since then, Izvolsky had burned with a desire for revenge, and throughout the July crisis he would encourage the French government to take as belligerent a line against the Germans and Austrians as possible. When hostilities finally broke out, he is supposed to have said, "This is my war." As of yet, the French role in the crisis was a passive one. Poincaré was not yet prepared to announce full mobilization, but he was pleased to hear reports that colonial troops from North Africa were arriving in France as a precautionary measure. If Europe went to the brink, he knew that Germany's first act was likely to be an invasion of his country, and he was determined to be ready. In Berlin on the morning of the 29th, General Moltke, chief of the General Staff, was getting nervous. Even though the Russians had not yet formally mobilized against Germany, he was receiving more and more disturbing reports about secret troop movements in Poland. Moltke and the Minister for War, Erich von Falkenhayn, spoke to Bethmann-Hollweg, asking that he advise the Kaiser to declare a state of imminent danger of war. This was the German pre-mobilization plan, similar to the period preparatory to war plan which the Russians had declared 3 days earlier. Bethmann-Hollweg was not as yet willing to recommend this to the Kaiser. He thought it was too provocative. However, he agreed to send a telegram to Russia warning the St. Petersburg government that if its own mobilization steps did not cease immediately, Germany would begin pre-mobilization. For Bethmann-Hollweg, the key power now was not so much Russia as Britain. The German Chancellor was becoming increasingly resigned to the idea that a war with the two continental members of the Entente, France and Russia, might be unavoidable. But he still hoped that it might be possible to persuade Britain to stay out. Bethmann's concern was not that Britain would be able to seriously interfere with the Schlieffen Plan. Its little all-professional army was considered far too small to be able to make any difference to that. But a war in which Germany was fighting Britain, as well as France and Russia, would be a different kind of conflict from a purely continental war. If Britain got involved, a European war would become a world war. Germany's colonies in Africa and the Pacific would be at risk. Plus, Britain, with its vast financial resources, would be able to bankroll the French and the Russians, while Germany had no wealthy partner of its own to fall back on. If Germany's lightning offensive against France failed, in other words, Germany would face a long, gruelling war of attrition, which it was likely to lose. So everything had to be done now to keep the British out. In order to accomplish that, Bethmann-Hollweg knew that it was vital to give the impression that Russia was behaving more belligerently than Germany. Hence his reluctance to allow pre-mobilization. Moltke, of course, saw things very differently. He had no interest in the wider implications of British intervention. All he was concerned about was the Schlieffen Plan. and he knew that every day that Russia continued its mobilization steps while Germany remained at peace, that was one day less that he would have available to defeat France. So for Moltke, the priority now was to start military preparations as quickly as possible. The constitutional split in the German government between the civil and military authorities was starting to show. In St. Petersburg, the telegram from Bateman-Hollweg warning the Russians to cease their mobilization efforts arrived at about the same time as news from Serbia that the Austrians had begun shelling Belgrade. To Satsanov, this was further evidence of German bad faith. Russia was being threatened at the same moment as the Austrians were ramping up their war efforts. He discussed this with the Tsar at 6 that evening. Tsar Nicholas was confused. The private telegram he had received from Kaiser Wilhelm the previous evening had been highly conciliatory, or at least had seemed so, and had promised to rein the Austrians in. Satsanov and the other ministers wanted Nicholas to agree to formally declare general mobilization, that is, mobilization against Germany as well as just Austria. The Tsar reluctantly agreed. He decided, however, to also send another telegram to Willy, asking for clarification of Germany's intentions. 40 minutes later, a second Willy telegram arrived. "I share your wish that peace should be maintained," it read. "I think a direct understanding between your government and Vienna possible and desirable, and as I already telegraphed to you, my government is continuing its exercises to promote it. Military measures on the part of Russia would be looked upon by Austria as a calamity which we both wish to avoid, and jeopardize my position as mediator, which I readily accepted on your appeal to my friendship and my help." The Tsar was surprised by how quickly this response to his own message had arrived, and interpreted it as a sign that the Germans were backing down. Impulsively, he immediately cancelled the general mobilization order he had just signed. "I will not become responsible for a monstrous slaughter," he is supposed to have said. In fact, the Tsar had misinterpreted the Kaiser's telegram, which was in fact responding to a message that Nicholas had sent on the 28th of July, not today. This, however, wouldn't become clear until Thursday. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Bateman-Hollweg was continuing his strategy of trying to keep the British neutral by meeting with Sir Edward Goschen, London's ambassador in Germany. Bateman-Hollweg felt that he had to offer the British something. He therefore promised that if Britain remained neutral in a war with France and Russia, then Germany would promise not to annex any French territory in the eventual peace settlement. Goschen asked if this promise also applied to French colonial territory. Bateman hesitated and could not give a definite answer. Then Goschen went further and asked about Belgium. Here the German Chancellor made a huge blunder. Yes, he responded, he promised that Belgian neutrality would be respected after the war. And what about during the war? Bateman could make no promise about that. In other words, the German was more or less confessing that his army was going to invade Belgium. If this was meant to reassure the British, it had precisely the opposite effect. It made London even more suspicious of German plans. Germany practically admits the intention to violate Belgian neutrality, as one Foreign Office diplomat commented after hearing the discussion. Britain was worried enough about a German attack on France. A German attack on Belgium would not only be a serious breach of international law, but would threaten British interests in the English Channel. There was hardly any prospect more likely to make the British intervene. There was more bad news for Bateman-Hollweg that night. A message arrived from his ambassador, Prince Lichnowsky, in London. Grey, losing patience with the Germans, was becoming less willing to play the role of neutral mediator. He had warned Lichnowsky that Britain would not stand aside and wait if Germany went to war with Russia and France. Bateman-Hollweg's hopes of keeping the British neutral were looking increasingly shaky. The Chancellor panicked. He reversed course. He sent a telegram to Vienna urging the Austrians to accept Grey's mediation efforts and not to continue any invasion of Serbia further than Belgrade. In other words, the man who previously had been demanding that Austria act as quickly and belligerently as possible was now suddenly rescinding the blank cheque he had issued on July the 5th and contradicting everything he had been saying to Vienna for weeks. It was now Thursday, July the 30th. German policy was in a hopeless mess. News arrived from St. Petersburg that morning from Germany's ambassador in Russia, saying that he had spoken to Satsanov and that the Russian foreign minister had told him that it would no longer be possible to stop mobilization against Austria. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, Moltke barged into a meeting between the Kaiser and Bateman-Hollweg, demanding that the imminent danger of war plan be declared immediately. The German Chancellor, who since his conversion the previous night now wanted to put the brakes on all military measures, insisted that this would be a dangerous provocation. The Kaiser, still hoping that his halt in Belgrade plan would work, refused as well. Furious, Moltke left and sent a telegram on his own initiative to the Austrian Chief of Staff, Conrad, demanding that Austria immediately mobilise against Russia. The government in Vienna was finding it increasingly hard to figure out what the Germans wanted of them. Remember, Bateman-Hollweg had just sent Berchtold a telegram telling him to back down. Now Moltke was telling Conrad to ramp things up. Who rules in Berlin, Bateman or Moltke? The Austrian Chancellor is supposed to have said to Conrad, as the two men were trying to unpick this muddle. The man who was supposed to be ruling Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm, could have resolved this confusion if he had been personally capable of it, but he was not. This was the price of having a constitutional system in which everything depended on the will of the supreme leader. If that leader was weak or indecisive, you were left only with muddle and uncertainty. In any case, the Austrians had now decided that the only remaining option to them was to double down. Berchtold and Conrad agreed that they would only be willing to consider mediation now if Serbia unconditionally accepted all the terms of the July the 23rd ultimatum, something that Belgrade would certainly not agree to, given Russia's clear evidence of support for them. General Austrian mobilization against Russia and Serbia would be announced the following day. All morning on the 30th of July, Russian ministers tried to get the Tsar to rescind the order he had made the previous evening, cancelling general mobilization. All morning, he refused. Then he met Satsanov at 3 o'clock. The foreign minister insisted that Germany wanted war and that Russia must respond. The Tsar, growing visibly pale, found it hard to answer. He reminded Satsanov of just what he was being asked to do, of what the consequences were likely to be, not just for Russia, but all of Europe. But if the Tsar was worried about inflicting a catastrophe on millions of people, he was even more worried about appearing to seem personally weak or indecisive. After thinking on it for some time, he made his decision. General mobilization would begin. When he received the order, the Russian Minister of War is supposed to have said that he would not accept another cancellation. Indeed, if necessary, he would smash his own telephone and go into hiding so that the Tsar could not order him to turn back again. All over Russia, the orders for full mobilization started being dispatched in great secret. In France, pre-mobilization began. The French made a point of letting the British know that they were deliberately withdrawing their troops several miles from the Franco-German border to prevent any accidental incident between the two sides. Paris was just as determined as Berlin to frame the developing conflict as a result of the other side's belligerence. But as it turned out, the French and Russians were going to do a much better job of this than the Germans and the Austrians. Okay, in the next lecture, we'll consider events on the last day of July 1914. See you then.